Clapperboard, you're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled, They Declared That the Orphans Must Be Sold. Human single father broke the chains, but this hap HFY. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now we begin. The first sound was not the siren. It was the hush before it, the odd, thin silence that sometimes falls over a place just before a storm. Outpost 9 held its breath. Solar dust lay over roofs like frost. Inside a small, patched hab unit of corrugated alloy and salvaged shipskin, a fan turned and turned and turned, struggling to move the morning's burnt air. Liam Torin was already awake, a shadow in the doorway, a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago in his hand. Shadows of a man who had once laughed more than he cursed traced the hollows under his eyes. He was 38 but carried 10 more years in his bones. The siren came next, deep-bellied. It rolled over the settlement and sank into the ground and up again through the souls of every human standing on that thin strip of frontier. It was the siren of arrival, of a visiting ship that had not asked permission to land, and every adult knew that sound. They had grown used to ships that came to buy ore and air and water. But when the siren was followed by a second tone, higher and metallic, there was a taste in the mouth like blood. That second tone did not belong to merchants. It belonged to the trade authority. Liam set the mug down gently, as if gentleness might keep the day from breaking. Behind him, a small figure stirred under a blanket, tangled in sleep. Mara turned on her cot, hair spilling like ink over a pillow he had cut from an old suit lining. Her cheeks were rosy in the way children's cheeks can be even in thin air. He stood there a moment, watching. He always watched her a moment before waking her on bad days, as if he might steal one more memory of her unafraid. "Mara," he said softly. "Up, starling." She didn't open her eyes. "5 more minutes," she mumbled, folding the blanket over her head. He smiled despite himself. "I'd give you 10 if I could." She slipped the blanket down until one brown eye peered out, suspicious of tricks. "Promise." He stepped to the cot and brushed a strand of hair away. "I promise I would, but the authority just landed. We have to move." The word hit like cold water. She sat up. "They said they wouldn't be back for months." "They say many things, boots on now." She obeyed with the quickness of a child who had already learned how to read an adult's voice. She tugged on a pair of scuffed desert boots and swung into a jacket with sleeves rolled up twice. Liam helped her seal the elbow patch. Air was thin on this world, and little leaks turned into headaches, turned into nosebleeds, turned into fainting. He lifted her up and slid a small pack over her shoulders. The pack was always half ready, water pouches, a coil of line, a multi-tool with an edge he sharpened while she slept. "What do they want this time?" she asked. He looked toward the door. "The same thing they always want, the things they say belong to them." "Us," she said. He didn't answer. He took her hand and stepped into the light. Outpost 9 was alive with movement, doors opening and slamming, figures running, a cart knocking into a post so hard the post rang. The sky to the east was filled with the sleek, unadorned hull of an authority enforcement cruiser. No markings of pride, only serial numbers. No paint beyond what kept the hull from shedding. The vessel hung in the air on magnets in contempt. Its belly hatch was already open. Dull figures poured out, soldiers in layered plate that made them more like beetles than men. The first rank held batons and force nets, the second, carbines, the third, tall poles with rings at one end that looked like shepherd's crooks. The crooks were for children, everyone knew that. The crooks went around small wrists, they clicked and locked, they dragged. The Council of 9, the settlement called it that despite it being a half-true joke, was already waiting in the square. They had been woken by a private ping from orbit at first light. Their faces were the faces of people who had learned to assemble as if their lives depended on it because they did. A woman in a patched robe adjusted the seal at her throat and stepped forward as the authority commander descended. This commander was tall and not quite humanoid. Its species had smooth glass skin that shifted shade to match the sun. It looked like oil pulled into a shape. Its eyes were twin rivers of mercury. The translator grill at its chest flickered with pale runes. When it spoke in the voice of 1,000 contracts. By decree of the Galactic Trade Charter, it said, this settlement is reviewed for debt service. Deliver quota on record, confirmation now. The patch-strobed woman lifted a data plate with trembling hands. We've paid what we can. The mines are thin this cycle. The ore, objection not logged, the translator said, quota unmet, penalty assessed. A murmur. Liam felt Mara's hand tighten around his own. He could feel her pulse race through his knuckles. He looked down at her and tried a smile, but it felt wrong on his face and died quickly. The commander raised one long arm and stones of light blossomed in the dusty air projections. Lines of text scrolled upward faster than any human could read. An image appeared below the text, a stylized silhouette of a small figure beside a larger one. The small figure pulsed. A tally appeared. Orphan indenture authorized, it said. All minors without registered genetic guardianship will be transferred to authority custody to satisfy debt. Compliance is mandatory. In the square, the air changed. It became a thing with weight like a blanket thrown over a face. A man near Liam made a low sound. That's half our kids, he said to no one and everyone. Half. The commander's head turned toward the sound in one smooth motion, but its face did not change. The soldiers stepped forward. By trade law, the commander continued, all adoptions lacking registered planetary genetic link are null. Liam felt something cold in his chest. Mara's head tilted. She looked up at him, not understanding that her life had just been argued out of existence in a sentence. He drew her closer. The soldiers spread through the square, crooks angled now, the metallic rings glinting. A soldier approached Liam and looked down at Mara, the helm's visor reflecting two small humans back at themselves. Documentation, it said. She's my daughter, Liam answered. DNA link, adopted. Adoption is not recognized in trade law. She is unregistered. She is property. The soldier reached for the crook. There are moments in a life where the world splits, where the soft thing in a person cracks like an egg and a new thing steps out that is not soft, that is simple and sharp and terrible. Liam had not known he could move that fast for 2 years, not since he twisted his knee trying to haul a busted scraper from a ravine. He did not know he would choose that moment to move faster than pain, but he did. His hand shot out and grabbed the crook. The soldier stared in surprise, a fractional pause, and Liam slammed his fist into the visor. The world rang. Sparks leapt. The visor spidered with cracks. The soldier fell back with a sound like a rock hitting an empty drum. The crowd inhaled as one being. The soldiers lunged. A baton met Liam's ribs in a jolt of white-blind electricity. He hit one knee and tasted iron and grit. Somewhere Mara screamed his name, and that sound doubled the size of the world and halved its distance. He roared and rose, grabbed the soldier's wrist and twisted, bone popping under gauntlet, baton turning in hands where a baton had no right to be. He swung. Armor dented. He swung again. The baton's head blew sparks like a meteor as it hit a helmet seam. The commander turned its perfect head and watched as if studying an animal in a field. There was no hurry in it. It had the patience of a law. When Liam staggered, when the nearest soldier raised a rifle, the commander at last lifted one glass hand. Remove the child, it said. Sell her with the others. The sentence ran through Liam's chest like a rod of ice. He had been a good man all his life in the way that most men try to be good, paying for the groceries in exact, carrying other people's boxes, showing up one more day than he felt he could. He had not been a soldier. He had not been a killer. He had given himself permission to hate without ever giving himself permission to act on it, because he knew what happened to men who did not. He had built air filters. He had taught children how to patch seams in their jackets. He had learned to cook on one burner and make it taste like home. In that moment, the ledger in him burned up. He felt nothing except a simple line of decision, a filament of steel running from his teeth to his hands. He stepped into a strike that should have put him on the ground again, turned, and drove the baton into the soft joint at the soldier's shoulder. The soldier's arm spasmed and went slack. The baton cut a crescent of fire through air and hit the commander's chest. Glass cracked. The commander took one step back. Its mercury eyes quivered like water disturbed by a thrown stone. Liam struck again because he was only one thing now, a man moving toward the center of the thing that would take his daughter and break the world into pieces around her. The second blow broke the commander's grill. Light bled out like smoke. The third blow never landed because a rifle cracked and pain slammed into his left side, a deep punch that folded him like a hinge. He went to one knee again and could not get up. He felt hot wetness under his shirt, and the dust was full of the smell of scorched air and human sweat and something like cinnamon. That was the alien's blood. He would remember later. A sweet smell wrong in a place like this. He fell forward, hands catching at grit, and saw boots close around Mara. The crook ring was around her wrist in a blur. It clicked. She cried out, high, outraged, betrayed. And then the square exploded. It was not explosives, it was people. The miners came first, heavy men and women with drill bits in their hands and dust in their lungs. The mechanics came with cutters and hook poles. The mothers came with kitchen knives, their faces white as chalk. They did not think of victory. They thought of a single swing, a single grab, and then another. The soldiers, trained to sequence and formation, were suddenly a pile of bodies inside a pile of bodies. A wrench crashed into a helm. A net fired and caught two authority soldiers and the woman who had leapt at them. She cut the net with a cutter used yesterday to free a stuck pump. Sparks dusted the air like tiny, hungry stars. The commander tried to shout orders, but its grill was broken, and what came out was a bubbling hiss. The soldiers pulled back to a wedge and did what wedges do, drive forward with a single purpose toward the children. Liam got to his feet with a sound like something tearing. He wasn't done being a person who stood. He ran. He barreled into a soldier whose crook dragged Mara. He did not think about his broken knee until it screamed like a thing in a trap, and then he thought of it only as something to be dragged along. He grabbed the crook's pole, slammed his boot on the clamp, pried, snapped the lock, and threw the ring away. He lifted Mara with both arms and ran. The next hours unscrolled at the speed of pain. He remembered little pieces, turning down the alley past Sarrow's machine shop where an arc welder screamed, splitting a line of soldiers with 5 other men who carried a metal door as a shield. Mara's breath, hot against his neck as he carried her, and she carried his pack and whispered, left, left, crawl now. The world tilted in the way that means blood loss. The storm siren that wasn't a siren at all but a gas line bursting flame. The commander's voice behind them, no longer human-voiced, but something like wind screamed through a broken bottle. They made the western fence as the first of the authorities' drop skimmers hissed down onto rooftops to cut off escape. There was a hole in the fence made months ago by children who wanted a way out to see the ravine where wild rock lizards basked. He pushed Mara through and went after, and the fence wire caught the back of his jacket and laughed in his face as it held him, and he knew if he stopped to fight it, he would die. He tore free. The jacket bit a piece from his back and kept it. He kept moving. The sand underfoot was as soft as flour. His boots filled with it and dragged at him. The wind came in a single hard shove and then another. Behind them the outpost burned. Not because the humans had set it, not exactly, but because once you fire a spark into dry grass, it becomes the whole field's choice. They ran into the waste and they did not stop until the sun was a white coin on the ground, and the world was a basin of red and black. They stopped then because the body can only be a miracle for so long. Liam lay on his back and the sky spun while he tried to measure his breathing. He rolled and coughed blood into his hand. He wiped it on the sand where it turned brown. Mara knelt beside him. "Dad," she said, and the word broke, and then she was crying and trying not to because she had learned that crying makes noise and noise is dangerous. He cupped her face with hands that trembled. "I've got you," he said. "I will never let them touch you again." "Why do they hate us?" "They don't," he said, and felt the lie shrink. "They don't think about us, they count." She stared at him, eyes red in the wind. "Then we'll be something they can't count." They're in the waste, with blood drying on his shirt, with pain like a second skeleton inside him. He believed her. They lived in caves for a while. Not caves that a story would choose with crystal and solemn grandeur, but narrow slits in a cliff where ancient water had chewed the rock. The mouth opened on a basin no one visited, except the kinds of birds that write their names on the air with wings and beaks like hooks. Inside, the air was cooler, and a trickle of seep kept a patch of moss alive that tasted like bitterness and rain. He fashioned a curtain from the tarp they had taken from a dead skimmer. He set traps that no one would call traps except the caught thing. He learned which hours the authority drones passed overhead and what their cameras could see. He wrapped his wound as best he could and lived day to day inside a sentence: keep her alive. The rebels found them the way thirsty people find water, by moving toward the sound of it. They were not a rebellion yet, not a word that neat, but they were a shape. Men like Sarrow the machinist, the woman in the patched robe, two boys who had killed their first authority soldier because children who grow up in cages learn quickly that keys are more important than permission. A nurse with a broken arm, a mechanic with a broken heart. They came in ones and twos, faces sharpened by fear. He counted 20, then 50, then 160, and understood that the authority had not landed on Outpost 9 to take a handful of children. They had landed on a fault line and stamped their boots. They were human and they were not alone. That surprised some and startled all. Among the faces were two alien miners from Keth who had walked 5 days along the desert's edge to find the man who broke the authority's commander's chest plate with a baton meant to be obedient. There was a small woman with 4 arms and skin like a plum who had been a cook on a trade tug until she smuggled 3 human children into a grain bin and jumped at low orbit with nothing but a garbage chute and a prayer. And there was a tall figure with a crest of bone over its head who stood back from the others a while, watching Liam the way people watch a fire that has not yet made up its mind whether to warm or consume. Later, Liam would learn the crest's name, Kira of the Shao. That day, Kira said nothing and guarded the mouth of the cave while he slept like one who had earned an oath he had not asked for. They did not plan a war at first. They planned days, food, water, air filters stolen from abandoned mine shafts, places where a child could run without being seen, messages to the next settlement that said they are coming, hide your young, and messages back that said we are hiding. They came before the message got here. We tried. They taught each other how to cut the trackers off the authority collars, how to open the locks on the cuffs without breaking the hand inside the cuff. They learned the way drones sound when they are full, and the way they sound when they are angry. They learned who could not keep a secret and sent those people to water duty where they would harm only the sand. They learned that human beings, given a task that is specific, can do almost anything. Liam's wound knitted into a tight band of scab under Mara's new stitching. She learned to thread needles in low light and to ignore his flinching. She learned to patch suit elbows without making a hole bigger than the one she was trying to mend. She learned to climb the cliff like a lizard and to slide her feet rather than step them when she walked on the basin floor so the sand kept her secrets. She learned to look like nothing at all when a drone passed overhead at dusk, and then she learned to look like a rock even when she wanted to scream into the sand until her throat bled. On the 23rd day, the authority returned to the basin. They came with skimmers that moved like knives, and with a scanner that smelled like winter and mint. They did not come to negotiate. They came to take what was theirs according to ledger, and a civilization that believed law was the only form of meaning. They entered the caves through the mouth, and 3 small holes no one had known were there except the rock and Kira, who had found them with a finger along the ceiling in that way that some species know stone like others know water. Kira lay in those small holes like a lizard and slid out behind the 3rd soldier and opened his throat with a hooked blade of bone grown in his forearm. The blood came quick and bright. Kira made no sound, and his crest did not move. That was the first time Liam saw Kira for what he was, a person who had decided long ago to be a weapon and had accepted the costs. They escaped that night by moving through stone. Not literally. This was not a tale of magic, but there are ways in and out of a place that people do not see until they are forced to solve the problem of survival. They moved 27 children through a hole a meter high and 3 meters long and out along a ledge, a hand's width across. They carried toddlers inside rough slings of tarp and rope, and the toddlers did not cry because someone had told them this was a game. At the last turn, the ledge crumbled under the weight of a man with a name that had too many consonants, and he fell with a noise like a bag of tools dropped from a ladder. He did not scream on the way down. It was long enough to scream, and he did not, and Liam thought about that for years on nights when he could not sleep. They lived through the winter that planet called winter. It was not snow but a cold that drew the heat from iron and bone. They learned to sleep in bundles like puppies, to share breath under seals made from cut t-shirts, to take turns at the vent fan so hands stayed warm enough to work. They learned that despair is a luxury you can indulge after the fire is stacked and the water boiled and the person beside you fed. They learned that grief can be worked too. They performed the old ritual humans have always performed. They said the names of the dead out loud in a small room, so the living would know they were not the only ones who remembered. Time passed in stacked days. The rebels grew into something that could go places. They started as a rumor, turned into a path, became a caravan with wheels long before they had a ship. They found and modified old mining transports that could cross the red basins, then stole 3 flatbed lifters from a forward authority depot by wiring a power surge and walking into the mess in authority armor borrowed from a man who would never use his again. They dressed stooped and cursed like soldiers cursed and ate boiled canteen soup, and left with the vehicles that were theirs now because they were needed. They drove in lines that looked like wind had drawn them on the sand. Authority drones searched. Authority learned that dogs are easy to chase and foxes are not. When the first ship came, it was not theirs. It was a smuggler from the Corps who had once lost a father to a mining accident the Authority wrote off as non-compliance with safe procedure. That was how the ledger recorded the end of a man who had liked coffee and sang off-key in the morning. The smuggler's name was Jace, and he had a tendency to run his tongue along his teeth when he lied. He walked down his ramp with empty hands and a smile that looked honest because it held no pleasure. Mara hid behind Liam's leg and watched his hands not for weapons but for tremor, because Liam had taught her that the tell of a liar is rarely in his eyes. "I heard you broke an officer's chest with a baton," Jace said. "I heard you've got 27 kids in holes and more on the way. Heard you need air scrubbers and protein paste and the kind of weapons you can teach a scared kid to use in an afternoon. Heard you've got no credits. Heard a lot of things." Liam's face didn't change. "What did you come for?" "2 things that make a universe move," Jace said. "A story and a promise." "What story?" that the trade authority isn't God, only a greedy man in a bigger chair. People forget that sometimes. They need reminding. Jace spread his hands toward the caves. You've been reminding them, and the promise that when you need a lift, I'll be there if I can. When I need a safe place to hide, you'll be there if you can. That's not a contract, Liam said. Exactly, Jace said and grinned like a knife. I don't like contracts, you don't either. They shook hands. Jace left with less than he brought because he had carried more than inventory in his hold. He had carried guilt. He came back with more. So did others. There is a strange arithmetic to courage. It multiplies by division. Every story of a child pulled from a transport berth like a lump of ore someone had tried to smuggle moved in whispers faster than authority drones could sweep frequencies. Dock hands on a station 100 light years away painted a broken shackle on the underside of a cargo lift where only someone lying on his back on a day he didn't want to work would see it. And the symbol spread because laziness and rebellion have long been friends when the Lord above is cruel. Mara grew up in that spread. When she entered the caves, she was 6. When she left them, she was 9 and had the eyes of a girl who could already see the inside of machines and the outside of lies. She learned to fly before her feet stopped growing. Not ships, not yet. She learned skimmers. She took a skimmer out 3 times around the basin before Liam knew her weight was not on the cot. And when he found her, she had parked it under a ledge and sat on the nose looking at stars like someone who had decided they were hers. She slipped off the nose and stood on the dirt with scuffed boots and met his anger like a rock meets water. She didn't budge, and eventually he went around. He taught her thruster control the next day. Because you'll go, he said, so you'll go right. The trade authority adapted the way all large animals adapt, slowly, with confidence that size is such a good argument it needs no refinement. They sent drones that listened for heat and found holes in stone. The rebels learned to vent heat up old mine shafts into nights, making their camp look like the memory of a winter. They sent patrols with dogs that smelled fear. The rebels learned to bury their fear and their meals in the same sealed sacks. The authority changed their contract language to make it easier to declare a minor orphan under emergency revisions. The rebels learned to send their youngest away days before the squeal of landing skids, into hands whose names they could not know until those hands delivered the child back, blinking, to a different refuge a month and a world away. They suffered. There are no victories without cost, and out here, costs were not on paper. People disappeared and did not return. A man named Hada took shrapnel in his thigh and bled into the sand while singing a song from a place he had never seen called bush air, whose water he swore tasted like copper. A girl named Lynn burned her hands opening a hatch and would never hold a pen. She learned to hold a cutter instead, and the day she cut an authority transport's umbilical on the wrong side of a lock and vented a cabin of rifles into black. No one remembered to mourn pens. A woman named Jola delivered a baby in a skimmer bay while drones hunted overhead. The child entered the world in a place where air smelled like oil and courage, and his first cry made 3 men stand up straighter without knowing why. Word went farther than men. Entire stations heard whispers in air vents. The authority tried to dam words with fear. They published bounties that would buy a city. They displayed prisoners in cages on the ring of Vel Karen, suspended above the blue swirl of the planet's storms like ornaments. Liam Torin hung there 1 year later. He had left the basin with a team to break a convoy, the largest yet, carrying 60 children in shock collars and soft shoes. They splintered the convoy like a hairline fracture that runs through a pane of glass after one tap, and they took the children and cut the collars and watched the kids run without quite knowing what their legs were for, because the legs had been for standing in line. They could not take everyone. They could not move fast enough. They saw the flares of coming skimmers and grabbed who they could, and he lifted a boy who had eyes the color of Green Lakes people write poetry about, and the boy's hands were sticky with sugar paste, And he laughed because he did not know what danger is, and Liam threw him into a skimmer and smiled, because there are moments when you are allowed. He stayed to cover their departure. He covered it. He did not leave. When the authority took him, he looked over his shoulder as if someone had called his name, and then he saw Mara standing in a hatch at the back of the last skimmer, and he shook his head once, no, and she sat down like a string had been cut in her chest. The station had a smell like clean glass and old rage. The commander who came to see him had a perfect face the way a blade has a perfect edge. It watched him like a scientist watches a sample. Its words were dry and practiced. It asked why he would risk anything for those who would never know his name. He said because they don't have to know to be worth it. It asked why keep fighting when the numbers say you cannot win. He said because numbers do not measure the difference between a child in a cage and a child who runs. It asked whether he would give the names of the others to shorten his sentence. He laughed, and the laugh sounded like a cough dragged across nails. They did not torture him in the way books like torture. They kept him in a glass cell where light did not change so he could not count, and they piped the sound of a child crying through the vents twice a day, and they brought food he could not eat because his hands shook, and the spoon scraped against the bowl, and the sound made the crying louder. They let him see the curve of the planet through a window placed where he could not stand without his neck hurting. They walked by and did not look at him, and that was the worst thing of all. He thought he would die there, not loudly, but in a dryness that steals the songs from the mouth. He made himself a stubborn promise. Every day he would push the spoon to his lips. He would eat. He would hold a piece of metal and name it hope. He would not sit down unless he had to. He would remember a smell, a real one, coffee gone cold in a room where a child slept and the day had not yet grown teeth. He did not die. A year is a long time to anyone who's counting and a blink to some who aren't. For Mara, a year was an anvil and a flame. She was 12 when he was taken and 13 when she held the control stick of a stolen shuttle and breathed out into a microphone that reached 10 systems and said words she had never planned to say aloud. They declared our children property. We declare them free. That sentence moved like lightning in dry grass. In bars where freighter pilots placed their glasses on sticky wood worn smooth by generations of hands. In tenements where families listen to vents because vents tell the truth. In barracks where soldiers closed doors and held their breath and pretended they were deaf. The sentence burned away a little of the helplessness that had become a kind of weather. They called her the daughter of the Chainbreaker because humans love names, and it hurt less to say daughter than to say the girl whose father is in a cage in a sky we cannot reach. She did not choose the name. She did not argue with those who used it. She simply learned to fly better. The Orphan Armada began the way some flocks begin, with 2 birds, then 3, then a shape that makes a hawk hesitate. 1 ship became 3. 3 became 11. Smugglers who had stolen for themselves learned to steal with purpose, because purpose makes a back lighter. Alien crews who had never fought for humans fought for children with faces that made their hearts remember their own. A Shal pilot flew a shuttle through a needle's eye and laughed for the first time in 7 years because laughter sometimes comes back when the gun stops talking and the engine starts singing. They did not fight the authorities' grand fleet. They fought their shadow. They cut off fuel lines with hacks and kindness. By meeting a dockhand who had a sister in a labor camp and saying the words, "We know her name," and meaning it. They hacked supply manifests and turned them wrong by one docking bay. They altered maintenance schedules so bolts that looked tight vibrated loose at the first burn and forced a ship to stand down while another ship, a human ship, ran past carrying 24 children who had taught each other to be brave by touching their knees in a circle when the lights went out. It is not easy to describe the texture of years like these. The days were ordinary and they were not. The sun rose and set. The burners burned. The hands chafed and healed and chafed. There were little loves in quiet places. There was a boy who wrote Mara's name on the inside of his knuckles in Greece because he could not write it anywhere else, and he was 14 and could lift a crate like it was a thought. And he died in a corridor when an authority rifle found him in a bend. There was a woman who learned she liked the taste of dried citrus and laughed at herself because it had been so long since she'd liked anything trivial at all. There were words that mattered. I'm here. I see you. Eat. Sleep. Run. Stay. Words that followed people like shadows and did not cost anything and cost everything. There was also an invention. Not a big one. A small one that multiplied itself. A human named Zin, who had worked in the authority's data lattice, designed a filter that could sit inside an authority visor and show the wearer what he was doing as if from the outside. It was a trick of mirror neurons and patterns, a way to make an alien soldier see a hallway twice, once with a child running in it and once with a child on the floor not moving, and have to choose with the knowledge of that picture held under the skin. Some turned away. Not all. Enough. One day, a door opened in the station at Vel Karen. It opened because Kira had studied the station's vent maps until lines on a page became air in his head, and because Jace had bribed a technician with the promise of a seat on a ship that would not exist if he did not unlock a panel, and because Mara, who had learned to move through spaces that were not made for bodies her size, fit herself into a conduit with a coil of line and a tool for cutting through anything that thought itself closed. She cut. She burned. She sweated until the cut sweat stung her eyes and she blinked and the cut wavered and she held her breath and pushed. A panel slid away. The door opened. They went through. Liam was thinner now and pale, a man whose edges had been sanded by a sea. He was standing because he had promised to stand. When the door slid aside, he did not trust the shape in the opening because the shapes that opened his door came with bowls he could not eat and a sound that was not a sound. The figure stepped in, and the light behind her made her hair a halo of wires and flame. She reached for the lock with a tool. She did not speak until it clicked and the panel slid and he was free to bring his hands down. Then she said it, the name that had not been spoken in a year inside this place. The name that broke his knees by removing their stiffness. Dad. They held each other. The way people hold each other when the world is not large enough to hold what they need it to. They did not say the things people say when they have been apart because there was no time. They said the words that are short and heavy. Yes. Here. Now. Go. Later they would say all the rest. They would sit under a canopy of scavenged sailcloth and speak each other's years back into coils of words and gesture and silence. They ran because everything after the door was open was always running. They ran through a corridor of glass that looked down on storms larger than continents, their lightning like nerves inside a sleeping god. They slid into a service chase that stank of old coolant and fear. They met a guard who had not seen Zin's mirror and made a choice. Kira made another. In the choked silence after, they moved with faces that did not allow morning to break their stride. They reached a dock where Jace's ship sat like a guilty conscience, and the alarm started, and a voice somewhere said, "Containment breach." And the universe special to that station panicked, as if it had expected to be safe because it always had been. They left. The ship tore space, the way ships do, and space tore back, the way space always does, and then they were somewhere else, and the first thing Liam smelled was oil and joy, and he sat down on a crate and laughed until his ribs ached, and he couldn't get enough breath, and he let himself cough for real for the first time with no crying through the vents to make him stop. The next years were a different kind of war, a war of light and law and the place where they overlapped and burned. Authority sent its grand fleet because it had learned that children were leaving cages and not returning, and there is nothing an empire hates more than the embarrassment of discovering that its assumptions have been seen through. The fleet was an argument made of metal. It could not be outnumbered. It could be outmaneuvered. The Orphan Armada did not face it head-on. It turned the fleet into an inconvenience. It made it heavy and slow and expensive to park. It harried. It split. It taught the fleet to swing its attention like a blind man with a cane while the child walked around him and out the door. The Battle of the Sea of Shards lasted 4 days and was fought in silence because the place where they met was an old debris field where someone's civilization had cracked 100,000 years ago and left bright pieces of itself scattered for scavengers and epics. The fleet came in on a high vector, clean as a parade. The armada arranged itself as if it were running, and then it ran, and then it doubled back and the debris hit it, and then it slid through a hole the fleet could not follow because it had never learned to slither. At one moment on the 3rd day, an authority flagship fired and hit a mirror field that Mara had placed 2 hours earlier, and the beam jumped like a frog and kissed the belly of its sister ship. And the sister ship shuddered and went dark, and something old and ugly in men who had been children in cages cheered. On the 4th day, the fleet pulled back to a place where it could count itself, and found that it could still count very well and still had lost the thing it had come to fetch. A convoy of mining schoolchildren taken at gunpoint from a ring and scheduled for a transit that would have erased their names and replaced them with numbers. Those children were on a freighter with a floor that smelled like chemical lemons, and their laughter beat through the hull like a manageable storm. A woman on that freighter watched their faces and wept into her sleeve because it had been a long time since she believed a thing could work, and it had, and she was so tired of being wrong. The authority tried a different weapon then. It tried pity. It broadcast messages that said, "We will feed you, we will educate your young, you will not suffer, come home." It set up homes with neat floors and rules that made sense if you never used your senses. It offered them to children who had never had their own bed. Many refused, a few went. It hurt to watch, the way it hurts to watch a moth find the only light and burn itself on purpose, because it is better to burn in certainty than to shiver outside in wind and not know if morning will come. The ones who went, some came back. They came back with eyes that did not look where they were told, and hands that shook when they touched door handles because doors can be traps. They came back with the plans to those homes written inside their memories, and the names of the guards spoken in sleep. They did not come back empty. There were losses that felt like the universe proving it could still take the throat of a brave thing and squeeze. Sarrow died in a fire he was fighting not with water, but with a wrench and a curse when an authority skimmer exploded 2 decks below his hands. Jace's ship didn't come back from a run to a station called the Bell, because a man on the dock with a good smile and a crooked ear, like he'd been born listening wrong, sold his name for the ticket he needed to leave his own bad life. The man did not get the ticket, and that was a small justice that does not match a large grief. The woman in the patched robe was shot through the neck on a morning that looked like it might not do anything worse than wind, and she died in a bed under a tarp while Kira watched her go, and for the first and only time Liam ever saw, let his crest droop like a flower in heat. Mara lost a finger and found another way to fly. There were victories so bright they hurt to look at. A transport docked at a place called Sinanport with a hold full of children labeled as parts for a machine no one had ever seen. A dockhand who had decided to look the other way looked the other way and saw through a seam where eyes should not be, and then he did not look away. He opened a panel. He found a small face. It whispered thirst. He gave it water, and then he gave all of them freedom, and then he gave Mara a coded ping that sent 3 ships on burning vectors. And then he gave his life when the authority found the hole he had left and connected the dots and connected him to a wall with nails. His name was Tur Eki, and the ships painted it on their hatches in grease so it would carry and smell right and have to be repainted again and again, because some names should not wash off. The law changed like weather changes at the end of a season, slowly, then all at once. There were debates on stations where no human had ever been allowed to talk in the big room. There were arguments that sounded like songs and songs that were arguments. An alien who had never met a human child held a picture and said, "This is not a unit," on a channel that reached the homes of people who had never let their minds make pictures of what they did not need to see. A vote failed by one and then passed by two, and then grew a garment of more votes until it was clothed in legitimacy. The authority lost funding in one arm and grew fangs in another, and tried to bite someone who had watched the first bite and brought a stick. In the end, law did not free the children. Courage did, and then law came after and pretended it had been running in front all along. Mara stood on a deck under a skylight that looked out at stars and looked like a window to a black ocean, and said into a microphone, "We don't want your throne. We want your hands off our children." The sentence was not new. The voice was. It carried a steady tone that made a soldier put his rifle down in a slow arc without realizing his hands had decided before his heart. It made a mother in the Corps who had never thought about humans at all step to her city council's panel and say that indenture is not a word. It is a mask, and she would not let her taxes pay for masks. It made a man in an office in a tower with glass that never opened sign a document he did not understand because his son had asked him the night before if he was a bad person, and that question is a kind of bullet. It made the fleet come. They met at a place between places because safe places were all gone. The map labeled it with numbers. The stories later called it the Gate of Dust. It was where two routes crossed and the space between was cluttered with the remnants of a planet ground to sand and ejected. Not a debris field like the Sea of Shards, but a fog that a ship could get lost in like a man gets lost in grief. He can see a meter ahead and no farther. The Grand Fleet arranged itself like chess pieces on a quiet board. The Orphan Armada did not array, it dispersed. It became mist in mist. It turned on lights where there should be dark and dark where there should be lights and asked the fleet to guess which one mattered. When the fleet fired, it hit the fog and the fog glowed and looked like triumph to someone who needed one. When the fleet moved, it moved as one. That was its strength. That was its weakness. On the second day, a sound rose that had not been there before. The combined noise of 100 ships' engines stretched on purpose to touch the frequency of a human voice singing in an empty room. It was a trick. It made the fleet's sensor net vibrate like a plucked string and show two where there was one. It made them chase phantoms. It made them nervous. Authority commanders don't like to be nervous. Nervousness implies humanity. On the third day, Mara led a wing through a hole in the fog she had made by heating it with a burn, and then cooling it with coolant sprayed like rain. She slipped between two cruisers whose captains had never seen a human face with their own eyes. She tagged one with a beacon that flirted with the cruiser's own beacons, and lied about its position by 3 ship lengths. The cruiser corrected by turning into its neighbor's path. In the moment when the neighbor's AI realized a collision was inevitable, it fired thrusters to climb over, and the climb presented its belly to a wedge of ships with human hands at their controls who had been waiting for a belly because top armor is strong and the belly is where you gut the animal. They fired. The cruiser's engine didn't explode dramatically. It coughed, shuddered, and stopped. And in the silence inside that enormous machine, humans heard the absence of killing as a music. On the 4th day, an authority ship facing an impossible choice transmitted, "We surrender." A second later, its sister ship transmitted, "We do not." A third said nothing and turned its guns away. A fourth said nothing and fired. War is not clean. It is a stack of moments like bricks, and some of the bricks are covered in something you cannot name, and some are clean enough to put your bare hand on and feel a warmth that is not all stolen. In the end, the fleet pulled back again because it had been made to doubt its math, and math without faith is numbers on a paper no one reads. There is a thing about victory. It looks like absence. The day after a battle is not a parade ground. It is a quiet. It is counting who is left and eating bread with grease on it and saying, "Be careful," to a man who cooks, because cooking after killing is a sacrament. It is standing at a viewport and looking at pieces of law floating in a dark no one made. It is sleeping for 15 minutes and waking and sleeping for 7 and waking and sleeping for 20 without a dream, because the body has used them up. It is telling a child who wakes crying that the noise he heard is a ship's pump and not a nightmare, although you also know the pump sounds like a nightmare when you are small. Liam stood at a viewport. He felt like a man who had walked to the end of a dirt road and had to decide whether to keep walking without a road under his feet. He watched debris drift and saw not debris but all the days that had brought him here stacked behind him like a wall he could not climb back over. He waited. He had learned to wait for the feeling that tells a person where to put his hands next. He felt it then, soft and ridiculous as a thread. Repair. They did the thing that sometimes embarrasses soldiers and politicians because it makes their speeches anticlimactic. They built. They built clinics and kitchens. They built schools and ships. They repaired what could be repaired and they buried what could not. They built laws on top of laws on top of stories until the stories were not needed to hold the laws up anymore because the laws had found their legs. The trade authority did not vanish in a puff of poetic justice. It shrank like a beast that has learned its hunting grounds are less profitable than they were. It changed its name because sometimes a new name lets an old thing pretend it has died. It did not stop being hungry, but it learned that some prey has teeth. There was a monument. It was not as grand as the council wanted and grander than Liam felt comfortable with. It was 2 hands breaking a chain. He did not stand at its base when they unveiled it. He stood in the shade of a vendor's umbrella watching children chase each other in a circle around it, screaming without fear. He ate a fruit he didn't know the name of and licked juice from his thumb. He felt a weight against his hip and looked down and saw a toddler holding his leg as if staking a claim. The toddler looked up with a free, stupid smile that only the protected can wear. Liam's heart kicked like a frightened animal, and then settled because he had learned to forgive joy its naivety. Mara did not stop. Some people do not know how. She learned to speak in front of rooms that had once only been for those who bought and sold and did not feel their hands getting dirty. She learned to say the words that make people stop tapping their screens and look up, and set the word aside like a food you were not sure you would eat, and then decide you need it. She flew less and thought more and did not forget to touch metal as she passed it, because metal is a friend that likes to be greeted. She fell in love once and did not tell anyone for a year, and then told everyone, and then lost him because people die and love is not a shield against that. And she learned to keep going with a hand that ached in air when it reached for a grip that was not there anymore. There was a day when a child asked her if she had been afraid. She thought about lying and decided to be useful instead. "Yes," she said. "I was afraid so much that I learned to carry it like water in a cup. It sloshes and sometimes I spill it, but if I pour it out, I die of thirst." There was a day when Kira went home to the Shao. He stood at the bottom of a ship's ramp while the wind on that world tried to lift his crest like a banner. He had left as a weapon. He returned as a man with a weight he was ready to set down. He looked at Liam and said, "In my language there is a word for the feeling you get when you see a storm coming and also the sunrise behind it. It is one word. You do not have it. You should make one." Liam said, "We have a word that serves sometimes. Hope." Kira considered. "Hope," he said, rolling it like a stone in his mouth. "Too thin, but I will carry it until you make a better one." There was a day when the last contract that labeled an orphan a unit of debt was erased from the galactic database. It came like a late winter thaws. Some ice released a day early, some not until the river rose. For many, the day passed like any other and they did not know they had been part of a change. For others, it was a feast day. They danced in a ring around the monument on Outpost 9 and threw dust in the air to make clouds like offerings. They read names aloud until a thunderstorm rolled in to do the reading for them. Lightning cracked over the metal roofs, and Liam stayed on the steps of his small house and held a hot mug of coffee that had just been poured and watched the sky burn and thought of the morning when the sky had burned for a different reason and he had chosen to stand. The galaxy learned, not all at once, not perfectly, but it learned. It learned that a species it had filed under labor resource would rather bleed than bend past the point that would break its children. It learned that courage is contagious not because it destroys fear, but because it teaches fear how to carry itself without spilling the cup. It learned that love is a logistics problem solved by hands that keep moving. It learned that the word orphan means a child with no parents in law, not a child with no one. It learned that debt is sometimes a theft wearing a suit. It learned that human beings don't become saints when threatened. They become the version of themselves that loves more stubbornly and breaks more things that needed breaking. And it learned Liam Torrens' name. He did not like hearing it said with reverence. He liked hearing it said at dinner tables where someone passed the salt and asked him whether he could fix a leaky sink. He liked being asked whether he wanted coffee. He liked being needed for small things because large things had taken so much. He liked holding babies and didn't care who saw him cry when one fell asleep against his chest. Some things rewrite the ledger again and again until what was owed becomes what is given. He walked often to the place where the fence had caught his jacket and taken a piece of him like a toll. It was repaired now with a panel of new wire that glowed in dawn light. Sometimes he would stand there and press his hand against it, and the metal would be cool and unyielding, and he would remember the feeling of it tearing at him and think, I lived. Then he would turn back to town because living is turning back to town again and again to carry water and sweep floors and tie a child's shoe. One night, long after the battles had become stories, and the stories had become the kind children hear before sleeping in safety, a ship came quietly and landed without a siren. It bore no authority marks and no rebellion insignia. It was a trader with a pilot who had never learned to stop at the edge of a life and call it enough. The pilot came down the ramp and looked around as if searching for a smell he remembered. He saw Liam sitting on the steps of his house with a mug that was not cold this time. He approached and stood with his hands in his pockets because some men hide their nerves where their fingers are. You're him, the pilot said as if accusing. Liam looked up. So they tell me. The pilot shifted. My father worked a ring. He was taken when we couldn't pay. I was supposed to, he swallowed, sell myself for his debt. He laughed short and sharp. I was mean about it. I thought I had a right to be. I didn't. Then one day people started talking about you like you were an answer, and I hated that because I don't like answers. And then one day I walked into a room and my father was there. Someone had moved him and he didn't know where he was, but he knew who I was. He scuffed a heel. I don't have a thing you need. He spread his hands, helpless and open. Thanks. Liam stared at him and felt something quiet under his ribs, a small animal settling down to sleep. You're welcome, he said, because he had learned that letting someone be grateful is a kind of gift in itself. They sat a while in the not silence of a world that is alive, the buzz of a generator, the whisper of rust, the shouts of children whose games had rules that changed mid-sprint. The pilot left when the stars brightened enough to show their bones. Liam watched him go and lifted the mug and drank and tasted coffee as it should taste, bitter and hot and a little sweet because he had decided life should be that way if it could be. Mara came home that night. She always did eventually. She had a way of arriving as if the space around her rearranged to let her through, which it did because some spaces know better than to argue. She sat beside him on the step and leaned her shoulder against his in an old ritual. He did not ask where she had been, she did not tell. They did not need to fill the night, it was already full. "What now?" he asked, because he liked asking her that. He liked what answers came. "Now we do all the things we said we would when we were too tired to move," she said. "We plant trees where beams fell. We put libraries in places with nothing on the shelves but dust. We teach kids to take apart an engine and a lie and put them back together and know why one should run and the other shouldn't. We build corridors with light and let people walk them without a number stamped on their wrist. We get good at boring." She smiled. "We teach the galaxy that boring is sacred." He laughed, and the laugh cut and then healed as it came out. "Do you think it learned?" She tilted her head as if listening to wind across wires. "I think it's still learning. That's enough." They sat until the night leaned toward morning and the sky lost stars one by one, like a child who cannot say goodbye all at once and drops a toy, then another until suddenly there are none. The settlement woke around them. Someone cursed a stubborn bolt. Someone called out a greeting to a neighbor they trusted with their back. A child shrieked with delight at a game only children understand. A dog barked and stopped because it had barked enough and got what it wanted, which was attention. A man in a new shirt walked under the monument and did not look up because he had already looked at it 100 times, and it had stopped being novel and had started being normal. And that was the point. The extraordinary becomes the everyday or it fails. In a far place, an old authority commander with eyes like metal stood in a room that had once been full and was now less so. It watched a recording of a child's face, a child who had said thirst into a dockhand's palm. Its crest, if it had one, might have moved, it did not. It turned off the recording. It stood there and thought, perhaps for the first time in a long time, about being young and being told that numbers are enough to guide a life and not knowing, until now that numbers are only fences and fences are only useful if what they hold in is shame. It did not change that day. It changed a day later, slowly, like a tide. A story is not a straight line. It turns back on itself and ties knots so it will not be lost. The Chainbreaker story tied its knots in hands and names and places, in a basin of red dust, in a ring of metal in a black sky, in the word Dad spoken in a doorway. It ended many times in small ways, and refused to end in the big way until it had taught what it had to teach. That selling children is a confession of bankruptcy, that no amount of profit can erase, and that a single man who refuses to accept the price can break a ledger with his hands and his voice, and the people who gather when a hand lifts a baton not to enforce but to defend. Somewhere, in a school with windows that opened and closed at the will of small fingers, a teacher told a class. They declared that the orphans must be sold. The class made the sound that means confusion and anger and hunger all at once. The teacher held up a picture of two hands breaking a chain. A human single father broke the chains, she said. But this happened too. She pointed at a mirror on the wall. The children saw their faces, and each needed to interpret what he saw with the tools he had. One saw a hero he wanted to be and went home to help his mother wash dishes with more care than before. One saw a man who had failed to save everyone and understood that perfection is a lie. He would therefore try and keep trying without letting failure feed him. One saw a woman with a crest of bone stand beside a human and know that solidarity is not a word but a habit. The habit of endurance is not glamorous. It is waking and choosing to stand and choosing to bend and choosing to stand again. It is breaking a baton and cooking soup. It is cutting a lock and mending a sleeve. It is holding a hand and letting go. It is taking a breath in a cell and taking a breath on a step and tasting coffee and stars and not choking on either. It is letting the galaxy learn at the rate it can, while insisting with your life that it learn. In time, the words indenture custody slipped out of mouths less easily. In time, A soldier holding a crook looked at the ring and could not make his hand close it around a wrist. In time, a commander raised a hand and then dropped it and said, "Stand down," because his child had asked him a question it took him a year to answer. In time, the world called Outpost 9 changed its name to something nobody could agree on, so they kept both names and laughed and grew and forgot blissfully to be afraid of the sky. Liam Torin grew old. He did not mind. He had dreamed of it when it seemed impossible, and dreams kept are sweeter than dreams broken. He lost hair and found patience. He traced the scar on his side sometimes with a finger, like a rosary over a bead. He visited the graves and the schools and the kitchen with the best bread and stole a slice, and told the baker it was terrible, and the baker threw flour at him and cursed with affection. He watched Mara become more herself, and he felt a pride that hurt the way good pain hurts. He fell asleep in a chair and woke to a world still there, stubborn as a child who knows the park is not closing even if the sun is low. On a day like the day that began all this, when the air felt like something waiting and the sky was a held breath, he stood again on the steps with a mug in hand. He looked up as a ship cut the air. He did not tense. It was not an authority shape. It was a freighter with a line of paint a child had once applied and no one had dared remove. A broken shackle drawn in a hand that had got it wrong but gloriously wrong. It landed. Children ran to the ramp because now ramps often meant friends, not chains. He drank and let the steam fog his upper lip and thought, perhaps, finally, the time had come to sit and tell this story to someone who had not heard it, not as legend, but as the thing it had been. Days and nights, screams and laughter, metal and skin, a baton breaking a chest and a child's hand gripping a father's shirt, and the way a world can change when ordinary people decide to perform an extraordinary habit for as long as it takes. He began to speak, in the simple words of a man who does not need to decorate what is already vivid. He told about fear. He told about the moment where his life split. He told about the smell of alien blood and cinnamon in dust. He told about a year in glass. He told about a door opening like a mouth that had been shut too long. He told about ships singing. He told about boring being sacred. He told about the way a hand and a crook can fill a world and the way the world can shrink to a hand and a crook and expand again to a sky you own because you will not be told you cannot. He ended, as good stories end, by setting down the weight and letting someone else pick it up. He looked at the cluster of faces, children, yes, and mothers and fathers and those who claimed neither and both. He did not ask for applause. He asked for help carrying chairs back inside because chairs need carrying and heroes who refuse to carry chairs are not heroes. They carried. They laughed. They went to dinner. They did not know that somewhere, something that called itself a law learned from their bodies how to be a law that did not break what it touched. Night came gentle. The stars above Outpost 9 were sharp and close, as if they wanted to be counted and could be, but not by a ledger. The wind hummed with the song of a fan in a window that had not been there when the day began. Liam closed his eyes and breathed and thought of a little girl saying, "Left, left, crawl now," and smiled because he had obeyed and lived. Mara stood beside him and watched the stars and did not count them because she had learned that counting is for soup spoons and bolts and subtle joys, not for galaxies. The story did not end because stories like this do not. They pass into hands and mouths and become the muscle of a culture. They feed children who are no longer hungry and give them something to push against so their arms grow strong. They remind old men to stand when a child enters the room. They teach aliens to say human words with their own accents and not be ashamed of how the words fall but be proud they are trying. And when anyone asked why, there was only one answer that mattered, and it was the one the galaxy had been taught by a single man who stood between a crook and a wrist and decided that law was not enough to make a thing right. And that day, the galaxy learned, humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.